The Bible is often described as a book of ultimate wisdom, a guide to morality, and the foundation of faith for billions of people. But when you look closer, it becomes something very different. Instead of being a fortress for belief, it can become the very source of doubt. In fact, some of the strongest reasons to question religion are not found outside of the Bible, but right inside its own pages. When people first open the Bible, they expect consistency, harmony, and clarity. What they find instead is a patchwork of voices written by many hands across centuries, often contradicting one another. These contradictions are not small details like spelling errors or differences in style. They strike at the core of the text itself. Take the opening chapters of Genesis. The first account of creation describes a God who creates light, sky, land, sea, and life in a structured order over 6 days. But turn the page, and another account appears. In this one, humans are created before animals, and the story unfolds in a different rhythm. If this book were meant to be a flawless guide, why does it fail to keep its story straight within the very first chapters? The contradictions continue through the narratives. In one gospel, Jesus is born during the reign of King Herod. In another, he is born after Herod's death, under the governor Quirinius. These timelines are separated by years, which means at least one of them must be wrong. And if the Bible cannot even agree on when its central figure was born, what does that say about its reliability? Beyond contradictions, there are deeper questions about morality. The Bible is often held up as the ultimate moral authority, yet within its pages you find instructions that would be unacceptable in any society today. Rules endorsing slavery, laws demanding the death of disobedient children, and commands to wipe out entire groups of people. When confronted with these passages, many readers are left wondering, how can this text be the standard for right and wrong? Apologists often argue that these verses must be read in context. But if morality changes with time, if it shifts and adapts to the culture of the day, then how can the Bible be eternal? If it needs constant reinterpretation to avoid condemning itself, then it cannot serve as a stable foundation. Another striking problem lies in the promises made. The Bible speaks of prayers being answered, of mountains moving if faith is strong enough, of the righteous being protected. Yet in reality, prayers go unanswered every day. Innocent people suffer despite endless devotion. The promises in Scripture often fail, and that failure forces thoughtful people to question whether the words are true at all. Consider the book of Job. It tells the story of a man who loses his family, his health, and his wealth, all to settle a bet between God and Satan. The lesson is supposed to be about perseverance and faith, but read it closely and it reveals something disturbing. Job's suffering is not the result of his actions, but of divine cruelty. His children are killed as part of a cosmic experiment. If this is presented as an example of justice, then what kind of justice is it? The Bible also struggles with the problem of free will. On one hand, it insists that humans choose their actions and are responsible for their sins. On the other hand, it repeatedly describes God hardening hearts, directing choices, and deciding fates before people are even born. If God hardened Pharaoh's heart, as the book of Exodus claims, then how could Pharaoh be blamed for resisting? This tension leaves readers with an unsolvable paradox. Even prophecy, one of the Bible's strongest claims to authority, unravels under examination. Many so-called prophecies are vague, open to interpretation, or written after the events they describe. Others fail outright. For example, Jesus says in the Gospels that his generation will not pass away until the end of the world comes. That generation has been gone for nearly 2,000 years. The prophecy failed, and no amount of reinterpretation can erase that fact. The Bible is also surprisingly human in its construction. We can see how stories borrow from older myths, like the flood narrative that mirrors the Epic of Gilgamesh. We can trace how laws and rituals reflect the cultures of the ancient Near East, not universal truths. We can even see how political struggles shaped which texts were included and which were left out. Far from being a single divine voice, The Bible is a collage of human attempts to explain, control, and comfort. These cracks in the foundation often become the very first steps toward disbelief. A person may start by asking a small question. Why do the Gospels disagree? Why do prayers fail? Why would a loving God command slaughter? And before long, the questions multiply until the Bible itself becomes the reason to doubt. What's more, the Bible doesn't only struggle under external criticism, it struggles under its own weight. Its pages provide the very evidence that challenges its authority. And when belief requires ignoring what is right there in front of you, many people realize that the stronger path is not belief at all. The Bible also presents an inconsistent picture of its central figure, Jesus. In one gospel, he speaks calmly, delivering measured parables. In another, he becomes fiery, overturning tables and cursing entire towns. In one version, his final words on the cross are a cry of despair. In another, they are words of forgiveness. These are not just minor differences in style. They reflect entirely different portrayals of who he was supposed to be. If the accounts of his life were inspired by one perfect source, why do they look so much like the stories of ordinary human authors, each with their own perspective and agenda? The resurrection, the cornerstone of the Christian faith, raises even more questions. Each gospel gives a different description of who went to the tomb, what they found there, and what happened afterward. Some accounts mention one angel, others two. Some say the women told no one what they saw. Others say they ran to announce it. If this event was the defining proof of divine power, wouldn't the witnesses agree on the basics? Instead, it looks exactly like what happens when stories are passed from one group to another, growing and changing with each telling. Beyond the contradictions, the Bible's worldview reflects assumptions that no longer fit with what we know today. For example, it describes the earth as flat, with a solid dome above holding back the waters of heaven. This was the common understanding in the ancient Near East, but today we know it's wrong. If the Bible were truly timeless and divinely inspired, why would it reflect outdated science rather than knowledge that could have stood the test of time? Then there's the problem of suffering. The Bible explains suffering in several different conflicting ways. Sometimes it says suffering is punishment for sin. Other times it says it's a test of faith. And sometimes it says suffering is simply a mystery beyond human understanding. None of these explanations provide real answers for the pain that innocent people endure. And when readers see the shifting justifications, they begin to realize these aren't divine explanations at all. They are human attempts to patch over difficult questions. Another major issue is the Bible's dependence on fear. It repeatedly threatens punishment not just in this life, but in the next. Eternal torment, destruction, or separation. These warnings are often more about control than about truth. They raise a serious question. If belief is so obviously true, why does it need to be enforced through fear? If the message is strong enough to stand on its own, why rely on threats to keep people in line? When you look closer at how the Bible has been used, the problem becomes clearer. Throughout history, people have drawn on its verses to justify slavery, to oppose science, to silence women, and to suppress entire groups. These interpretations aren't distortions by a few extremists. They come from passages that are right there in the text. And if a book can be used to defend both compassion and cruelty, both liberation and oppression, then what does that say about its reliability as a moral guide? The Bible also contains promises that do not match reality. Jesus tells his followers that if they have faith the size of a mustard seed, they can move mountains, yet no mountains have ever moved by faith. He says that believers will handle snakes and drink poison without harm, yet countless believers have died tragically trying to take these verses literally. If the words are meant to be symbolic, then they are misleading. If they are meant to be literal, then they are false. Either way, they fail as a foundation for truth. Another revealing detail is how the Bible presents history. Many events described as miraculous or world-changing leave no trace outside of the text. The Israelites wandering for 40 years in the desert should have left evidence, yet archaeologists find none. The census described in the Nativity story has no historical record. The darkness that supposedly covered the earth during the crucifixion is not noted by historians of the time. These gaps make it difficult to treat the Bible as a reliable historical source. Even when the Bible does reflect real history, it often reshapes it for theological purposes. Kings are portrayed as good or evil depending not on their actual rule, but on whether they supported one form of worship or another. Events are written to fit prophecy after the fact, blurring the line between history and theology. What results is not a trustworthy account of the past, but a narrative crafted to persuade. This becomes especially clear in the way the Bible handles prophecy. Some predictions are so vague they can be applied to almost anything. Others are edited into the text after the events they supposedly predict, and the ones that are specific often fail. When a text claims divine authority on the basis of prophecy but cannot deliver, it undercuts its own credibility. All of these issues raise an unavoidable conclusion. The Bible is not a perfect divine revelation. It is a collection of writings shaped by human hands, reflecting human culture, human fears, and human limitations. The contradictions, the moral problems, the failed promises, and the historical gaps all point to the same truth. The strongest reasons to doubt religion are not external attacks on the Bible. They are the Bible itself. One of the most striking features of the Bible is how openly it reveals its human fingerprints. For a book said to be perfect, it behaves in every way like other ancient literature. Stories get retold with changes, laws are repeated with variations, and earlier texts are edited or contradicted by later ones. And in some cases, we can even trace the sources. Scholars have identified older poems, myths, and cultural traditions woven into the final product. This doesn't look like the voice of a single flawless author. It looks like a community of people trying to create meaning, each one adding their own perspective. When we compare biblical stories to those of neighboring cultures, the overlap is unmistakable. The flood story echoes Mesopotamian myths that predate the Bible by centuries. The idea of a divine council where gods debate and rule shows up in Israelite texts, even though it mirrors older Canaanite traditions. Even moral codes, like the Ten Commandments, share close similarities with earlier law codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi. These connections show that the Bible did not come out of nowhere. It absorbed, borrowed, and reworked ideas already circulating in the ancient world. This has a serious implication. If the Bible reflects human cultures and their limitations, then it cannot stand as an eternal or universal truth. Instead, it reads like a historical snapshot, revealing how one group of people explained life and tried to regulate behavior. That may be valuable as history, but it's not evidence of divine perfection. Take the laws in the book of Leviticus. They cover everything from how to sacrifice animals to how to handle mildew in a house. Many of these rules seem arbitrary or bizarre today, yet at the time, they were part of the social fabric of an ancient tribe, helping them define themselves against neighbors. That context explains the laws far better than the claim of timeless divine wisdom. The same goes for biblical views on women. In some passages, women are treated as property, passed from father to husband. In others, they are barred from leadership or told to remain silent. Defenders of the text often argue that women are still valued, but the fact remains that the Bible reflects a patriarchal society. It's a reflection of its time, not a guide for equality. And once you recognize that, it becomes difficult to claim the text as a moral authority. The Bible also reveals its human side through its portrayal of God. In some books, God is compassionate, slow to anger, and forgiving. In others, he is jealous, vengeful, and quick to punish. At times, he walks in a garden or eats meals with humans. At other times, he is an abstract force beyond comprehension. These shifting portrayals are exactly what you would expect if different authors in different times projected their own experiences and ideas onto the divine. They are not what you would expect from a single, unchanging reality. Another major issue lies in the way the Bible handles justice. The concept of collective punishment appears again and again. Entire families, villages, or nations are wiped out for the actions of a few. Even children are not spared. If this is presented as justice, it clashes with even the most basic human understanding of fairness. It raises the question, are we supposed to adopt this as a model or recognize it as the product of a time when justice was more about survival and vengeance than fairness? One of the clearest examples of this tension is the story of the conquest of Canaan. The Israelites are commanded to destroy entire populations, sparing no one. Defenders of the Bible often try to explain this away, saying it was symbolic or limited, but the text itself is explicit. It portrays genocide as divinely commanded. For many readers, this is not just a troubling passage. It is evidence that the book reflects human warfare and tribalism rather than divine morality. And the Bible also struggles with internal logic about salvation and righteousness. In some places, salvation is said to come through faith. In others, it's about works and obedience to the law. In one gospel, eternal life is about following Jesus. In another, it is about serving others. These competing answers reflect different communities trying to define their identity, but they leave modern readers with a confused and inconsistent message. Even the afterlife is unclear. The Hebrew Bible often describes death as going to Sheol, a shadowy place where everyone goes regardless of morality. Later texts introduce ideas of resurrection, judgment, heaven, and hell, but the details shift constantly. By the time of the New Testament, heaven and hell become central, but even then the descriptions vary widely. Instead of a consistent doctrine, the Bible shows a gradual evolution of ideas. That is exactly what you would expect from human thought developing over time, not from divine revelation. All of these contradictions and inconsistencies push thoughtful readers to ask, if the Bible cannot offer clarity on the most basic questions, who God is, what justice means, how salvation works, and what happens after death, then what exactly is it offering? The closer you look, the less it seems like a book of ultimate answers, and the more it looks like a collection of human voices wrestling with questions they could not solve. And this leads to one of the strongest biblical arguments for disbelief. If a God truly wanted to communicate clearly with humanity, would the result look like this? Would it be a book full of contradictions, cultural baggage, and confusing messages? Or would it be something unmistakable, consistent, and clear across time? The Bible itself suggests that if a God exists, he has not chosen to reveal himself in a way that matches the claims of religion. One of the Bible's most revealing weaknesses is the way it handles doubt itself. Throughout the text, doubt is treated not as a natural response to uncertainty, but as a kind of moral failing. Those who question are condemned. Thomas, for example, is rebuked for wanting evidence of the resurrection. Yet in reality, the desire for evidence is not a flaw. It's the foundation of honest inquiry. When a text discourages questioning and treats faith without evidence as a virtue, it begins to look less like truth and more like a tool for control. That pattern shows up in the way authority is enforced. Obedience is demanded again and again, not just to God, but to kings, priests, and masters. Even when rulers are cruel, the text often instructs people to submit. This raises a troubling question. Is this divine wisdom, or is it a reflection of a society that valued order and hierarchy above justice? The more you look, the clearer it becomes that these instructions serve the interests of human power rather than universal morality. There is also the issue of failed expectations. The New Testament often speaks as if the end of the world was imminent. The letters of Paul, for example, repeatedly suggest that believers of his own time would live to see the return of Christ. Yet 2,000 years have passed, and the world continues. This failure isn't a minor oversight. It goes to the heart of the message. If the writers were wrong about something so central, how can their words be trusted as eternal truth? The Bible also struggles with consistency in its portrayal of God's relationship with humanity. In some places, God is said to be unchanging. In others, he changes his mind, regrets decisions, or responds to persuasion. For example, in the story of Jonah, God decides to destroy Nineveh, but then spares it when the people repent. This flexibility makes sense if the story is human-made, a tale meant to teach repentance, but it doesn't fit the idea of a perfect, unchanging deity. Another problem is the Bible's silence on issues that matter deeply in today's world. For a book that is supposed to contain divine wisdom, it says nothing about democracy, human rights, scientific discovery, or global ethics. It has no guidance on technology, medicine, or modern forms of justice. Instead, it is full of regulations about animal sacrifice, temple rituals, and dietary rules. This imbalance is striking. If the Bible were truly timeless, why does it focus on concerns so narrow and outdated while remaining silent on matters that shape human lives today? Even when the Bible addresses moral issues, it often does so in ways that clash with modern understandings of compassion and justice. Commands to kill people for minor offenses, to treat women as property, or to shun outsiders do not match what most people today would recognize as moral guidance. And the common defense that these laws reflected their time only reinforces the point. If morality evolves, then the Bible is not a timeless authority but a cultural artifact. The Bible also reveals the problem of selective interpretation. Believers often emphasize the passages that sound compassionate and ignore the ones that sound harsh. They highlight verses about love and forgiveness while brushing aside verses about violence and judgment. But if the book is truly divine, why should it require such careful cherry-picking? The need to filter the text suggests that not all of it can be embraced as truth, and once that door is opened, the authority of the whole text comes into question. Another issue lies in how the Bible portrays the natural world. In many places, it describes diseases as caused by spirits, storms as acts of divine anger, and disasters as punishment for sin. But today, we know diseases are caused by germs, storms by atmospheric systems, and disasters by natural forces. And the biblical explanations reflect the limited knowledge of ancient people, not divine insight. And if God wanted to communicate truth, why would he provide explanations that would later be proven false? Perhaps one of the most powerful arguments comes from the Bible's own standard. It repeatedly insists that truth should be tested, that prophets who make false predictions should not be trusted, and that evidence should matter. By this measure, the Bible fails. It contains prophecies that did not come true, contradictions that undermine its message, and claims that do not match reality. In other words, by the Bible's own criteria, it cannot be trusted as the final authority. The problem becomes even clearer when we consider how the Bible was compiled. The books were written over centuries in different languages for different audiences. They were debated, edited, and sometimes excluded entirely. Councils of church leaders decided which writings would be considered scripture and which would not. This process was deeply human, shaped by politics and power struggles. Knowing this, it's hard to see the final product as a single, divinely orchestrated message. It looks much more like the outcome of human decisions and disputes. And when you step back to see the whole picture, the Bible offers not a clear revelation, but a messy, conflicting, and often troubling set of writings. For some, that messiness is what makes it fascinating as literature or history. But for those who are told it must be the ultimate guide to life and truth, the flaws become impossible to ignore. The Bible itself, in its contradictions, its outdated morality, its failed promises, and its human fingerprints, becomes the strongest evidence against the claims made in its name. When people first begin to notice these problems, the experience is often unsettling. They may have been taught that the Bible is perfect, that it contains no errors, no contradictions, and no failures. But when the text itself begins to unravel those claims, the effect can be profound. It is not an outside attack on faith. It is the Bible exposing its own weaknesses. Take the issue of morality once more. The Bible often defines morality through obedience rather than compassion. Abraham is praised for being willing to sacrifice his own son simply because he was told to. In another story, Saul is condemned not for violence, but for failing to carry out a massacre with enough thoroughness. These are not examples of universal goodness. They are examples of loyalty to authority at any cost. And when you hold them up against basic human empathy, they fail to inspire. The Bible also creates divisions where unity might have been possible. It often sets one group against another, declaring some people chosen and others rejected. Foreigners, unbelievers, or those outside the community are treated with suspicion or hostility. This kind of tribalism made sense in the ancient world. where survival often depended on loyalty to the group, but as a model for humanity today, it falls short. If divine truth is meant to bring people together, why does the Bible so often draw lines that separate them? Another issue is the way the Bible portrays punishment in the afterlife. The idea of eternal torment appears most clearly in later texts, reflecting developments in Jewish and Greco-Roman thought, but the notion of infinite punishment for finite actions is deeply troubling. It clashes with any sense of proportional justice. If God is just, why would the penalty for ordinary human flaws be endless suffering? The doctrine looks far more like a human invention designed to instill fear than a reflection of any true justice. The Bible also reveals its limitations through silence on some of the most fundamental questions. And for example, it never clearly explains the origin of evil. In some passages, evil seems to come from human choice. In others, it is introduced by a serpent or a Satan figure. In others still, it is permitted or even orchestrated by God himself. The lack of clarity leaves readers with contradictory messages, none of which fully resolve the question. If this book were meant to guide humanity, wouldn't it at least provide a consistent explanation for why suffering and evil exist? Another striking feature is how the Bible frequently borrows from the worldview of its time rather than challenging it. For instance, ancient people believed illnesses could be cured by rituals, sacrifices, or exorcisms, and the Bible reflects those beliefs. But today, medicine shows us that germs, genetics, and environment are the real causes. A truly timeless book might have offered knowledge beyond the reach of its culture. Instead, the Bible mirrors the errors of its age. The Bible's treatment of knowledge itself is another revealing point. In the story of Adam and Eve, the very act that brings downfall is eating from the tree of knowledge. Knowledge is portrayed as dangerous, something to be feared, yet in reality, human progress has always depended on curiosity, questioning, and learning. If knowledge is a threat to faith, then faith is exposed as fragile, and the message of the story that ignorance is safer than understanding clashes with the very thing that allows humanity to grow. The contradictions extend to the idea of God's presence in the world. Some passages say God dwells in the temple. Others say he fills the whole earth. Some describe him as approachable, walking among people. Others say no one can see him and live. These conflicting portraits leave readers with no clear sense of who or what God is supposed to be. Instead, they suggest that different writers projected their own experiences and beliefs onto the divine, producing multiple, often incompatible images. Even the central message of salvation changes depending on where you look. In one place, salvation is about following laws. In another, it's about faith. In another still, it's about love and compassion. And sometimes it seems to depend simply on belonging to the right group. These shifting standards reflect different communities arguing over identity and authority. They do not reflect a single, consistent truth. All of these issues highlight the most important point. The Bible does not collapse under criticism because outsiders attack it. It collapses under the weight of its own contradictions and shortcomings. When read honestly and carefully without forcing the text to fit preconceived ideas, it reveals itself not as divine truth, but as human creation. This realization can be unsettling, but it can also be liberating, because once the authority of the Bible is questioned, space opens up for deeper exploration of truth. Morality can be built not on obedience, but on compassion and reason. Meaning can be sought not in fear of punishment, but in the richness of human experience. And questions can be asked freely without the burden of needing to protect a fragile text from scrutiny. One of the clearest signs that the Bible is a human product is how it changes over time. The God of early Israelite texts is primarily a tribal protector. He fights battles, defends one nation, and demands loyalty. But in later writings, that same God is described as universal, ruling over all nations and caring for all people. This shift shows the natural evolution of belief as human societies expanded and interacted with others. It does not look like the revelation of an eternal, unchanging truth. It looks like ideas adapting to new circumstances. This evolution appears in worship practices too. At first, sacrifices of animals and offerings are central. Later, prophets declare that mercy and justice matter more than ritual. By the time of the New Testament, sacrifices are replaced with spiritual devotion. Each stage reflects the concerns of its time, but the changes also reveal that no single model was final or permanent. If these were divine instructions, why would they keep changing? The Bible also shows its human origin in the way it absorbs political struggles. The stories of kings and prophets often read less like divine history and more like propaganda. Leaders who support one faction of priests are praised. Those who oppose them are condemned. Victories are attributed to God's favor, defeats to God's anger. This pattern is common in ancient writing, where gods are invoked to justify power. But when you recognize it, it becomes hard to treat the Bible as anything more than politics, written in sacred language. Even the way the Bible treats outsiders reflects human concerns more than divine wisdom. Foreign nations are often portrayed as enemies destined for destruction. Entire peoples are dehumanized and reduced to obstacles in the path of Israel's story. This kind of portrayal is common in tribal histories where the goal is to elevate one's own group, but it clashes with the claim that the Bible reflects a universal truth for all humanity. Another revealing issue is the Bible's obsession with purity. Detailed rules govern what foods are clean, what clothes can be worn, and what bodily conditions make someone unclean. These rules made sense in a world concerned with health and group identity, but they do not carry universal moral weight. Today, few people believe that eating shellfish or wearing mixed fabrics is immoral. Yet these rules are given the same divine authority as commands against murder or theft. The inability to distinguish between cultural regulation and universal principle shows the text's human limits. The Bible also contains passages that openly contradict the idea of a loving, all-powerful God. In some texts, God sends evil spirits, deceives prophets, or hardens hearts so that people cannot repent. In others, he tests loyalty by demanding acts of cruelty. These portrayals raise troubling questions. If God is good, why would he behave in ways that humans would consider unjust? And if these stories are not literal but symbolic, then they reveal more about human fears and control than about any divine being. Perhaps most striking is how the Bible often discourages independent thought. It calls for obedience above all else. Even when commands seem harsh or irrational, the response expected is submission. Yet, true morality often requires questioning authority and challenging injustice. By teaching that obedience is the highest virtue, the Bible risks undermining the very qualities that make morality meaningful. The tension between belief and evidence also plays out within the Bible itself. In one story, Gideon asks for signs and God provides them. In another, people are condemned for asking for proof. The mixed message is clear. Sometimes evidence is allowed, sometimes it is forbidden. But if truth is real, it should not fear investigation. The inconsistency suggests that the writers were more concerned with maintaining authority than with inviting honest inquiry. The Bible also shows its limitations in how it treats knowledge from outside sources. Wisdom from foreign nations is sometimes praised, but often it is dismissed or condemned. The message is clear. Truth is to be found only within the chosen community. Yet history has shown the opposite. Knowledge has flourished when cultures share ideas, learn from one another, and remain open to discovery. By discouraging this, the Bible reveals its roots in a time when isolation and loyalty to one group were valued more than universal understanding. All of these features make the Bible fascinating as a window into human history. It reveals how people struggled with questions of meaning, justice, and survival, but they also make it deeply unreliable as a divine guide. The contradictions, the cultural baggage, the political motives, and the moral blind spots all point to the same conclusion. The Bible is not evidence for belief. It is evidence for disbelief. The irony is that many people who set out to study the Bible deeply, expecting to strengthen their faith, find that their faith weakens instead. The very book that's supposed to provide certainty often produces doubt. And for those willing to follow that doubt honestly, the Bible becomes not a foundation for belief, but one of the strongest arguments against it. One of the most powerful arguments hidden within the Bible is the way it exposes its own human conflicts. Different authors often argue with each other across the pages. The prophets condemn ritual sacrifice while the priests defend it. Ecclesiastes claims that life is meaningless and death ends everything, while other books promise eternal rewards and punishments. The Gospels themselves emphasize different visions of Jesus: a teacher, a miracle worker, a suffering servant, or a cosmic ruler. These disagreements show a conversation happening within ancient communities, not a single voice of divine certainty. The book of Ecclesiastes, for example, presents a view that feels almost modern. It claims that all people share the same fate and they die, and that human achievements are temporary. It says the best one can do is enjoy simple pleasures while alive. This perspective sits uneasily with later promises of heaven and hell. If the Bible were a unified message from beyond, why would it contain such radically different answers to the same question? The diversity of views makes sense if it is a collection of human reflections, but not if it is meant to be divine revelation. The book of Jonah offers another striking example. Its message is that God cares even for Israel's enemies, and that compassion should extend beyond tribal boundaries. Yet this generous vision stands in sharp contrast with other texts that call for the destruction of those same enemies. The tension between these perspectives reflects human debate about how to treat outsiders. It does not reflect a consistent moral standard from a divine source. Another revealing case is the book of Job. Its message directly challenges the idea that suffering is always the result of sin. Job is described as righteous, yet he suffers terribly. His friends insist that he must have done something wrong, but the story insists otherwise. This is an honest wrestling with the problem of evil, but the conclusion that humans should not question God offers no real solution. The honesty of the struggle is human. The failure to resolve it is also human. Even the Bible's use of numbers and genealogies reveals its human origin. The ages of patriarchs stretch into hundreds of years. The census counts often reach into the millions, far beyond what ancient populations could realistically sustain. These numbers are symbolic or exaggerated, not historical. They show the same tendency found in other ancient literature to use numbers for meaning or impact rather than accuracy. The Bible also contradicts itself in its approach to wealth and poverty. In some passages, wealth is a sign of God's blessing. In others, it is condemned as a trap that leads people away from righteousness. Jesus praises the poor in one gospel, but is hosted by wealthy supporters in another. These contradictions reflect the fact that different communities had different experiences with wealth. Some saw it as security, others as corruption. The result is a mixed message that cannot serve as a consistent guide. The issue of violence is equally troubling. Some psalms celebrate smashing the infants of enemies against rocks. Others speak of peace and universal harmony. The prophets sometimes envision swords beaten into plowshares, yet also describe brutal destruction of nations. This inconsistency mirrors the swings of human emotion: anger, fear, hope, and longing. It does not resemble the clear voice of an eternal being. Another clue is the way biblical authors deal with failed predictions. When prophecies do not come true, the response is often to reinterpret them or to push them into the future. For example, the promise that the end would come soon is later explained as a mystery of God's timing. This pattern of shifting explanations looks exactly like what happens when humans try to preserve authority after being proven wrong. It does not look like the voice of truth. The Bible's treatment of wisdom literature is also revealing. Proverbs promises that wise living leads to success and safety, yet Job directly contradicts this by showing a righteous man suffering despite his wisdom. Ecclesiastes dismisses both by claiming that chance and death erase all distinctions. These competing messages make sense in a human collection of writings where different authors wrestle with life in their own way, but they undermine the claim that the Bible offers a single, reliable truth. Another striking problem is how the Bible treats prophecy about Jesus. Verses from the Hebrew Bible are often quoted in the New Testament as predictions of his life. Yet, when read in their original context, many of these verses are not about a future Messiah at all. They refer to events in the prophet's own time. The The reinterpretation only makes sense if later writers were rereading old texts to support new claims. In other words, the prophecies are retrofitted, not fulfilled. This leads to one of the most important realizations, and the Bible does not collapse under modern criticism alone. It collapses when you let it speak for itself. Its contradictions, moral failures, and failed promises are not hidden. They are right there on the surface. For those who read carefully, the Bible itself becomes the evidence that undermines its own authority. And for many, this recognition is not a loss, but a step toward clarity. Because once the Bible is understood as a human product, its problems make sense. The contradictions are expected, the moral failures are historical, and the shifting views are natural. What remains is not a divine mystery, but a record of human struggle, and in that recognition, people often find more honesty than in any claim of perfection. The Bible also raises deep questions about prayer. Over and over, it promises that prayers will be answered. Jesus himself says that if people ask anything in his name, it will be done. Yet in practice, prayers often go unanswered. People pray for healing that never comes, for safety that is not granted, for peace that never arrives. Defenders of the text often add qualifications, that prayers must align with God's will, or that unanswered prayers build character. But these qualifications are not found in the original promises. They are later explanations to cover for promises that failed. The Bible also presents a troubling pattern in how it attributes events to divine action. Victories in war are celebrated as God's intervention, but defeats are blamed on human sin. Blessings are credited to divine favor, but suffering is explained as punishment. This pattern ensures that God is never at fault, but it also makes the claims unfalsifiable. If every outcome can be explained as part of a divine plan, then no outcome can ever count against it. And this is not evidence of truth. It is a sign of circular reasoning designed to protect belief. Another revealing issue is the way miracles are described. They are often dramatic in the text. Seas part, the sun stands still, the dead rise. Yet outside of the text, there is no evidence for these events. No records in neighboring cultures, no physical traces, no independent accounts. These stories resemble myths more than history. And when compared with the everyday experience of the world, where miracles do not happen on command, they raise more questions than they answer. Even the New Testament letters show human conflicts. Paul and James appear to disagree over whether faith alone or works are needed for salvation. Paul argues that circumcision and dietary laws are unnecessary, while other leaders insist on them. These debates reflect a community struggling with identity, not a unified divine message. The disagreements are exactly what you would expect in a growing movement trying to define itself. The Bible also reveals human motives in its use of fear and reward. Promises of eternal paradise are paired with threats of eternal punishment. These are powerful psychological tools. They motivate behavior not through reason, but through hope and fear. When a system relies on emotional manipulation rather than evidence, it becomes clear that its goal is control, not truth. Another important clue lies in how the Bible treats knowledge from nature. Instead of encouraging curiosity, it often discourages questioning. The story of Job portrays God as beyond understanding, dismissing Job's questions rather than answering them. The message is that humans should not seek too much knowledge, but accept their place. Yet history has shown that seeking knowledge is precisely what allows humanity to thrive. By discouraging inquiry, the Bible stands against the very process that leads to real understanding. The Bible also makes promises about protection for the faithful that do not hold up. Psalm 91 says that believers will be shielded from plague and disaster. Yet pandemics have swept across history, affecting the devout and the unbelieving alike. Wars, famines, and natural disasters have not spared those who prayed. These promises, when tested against reality, collapse. And when the promises collapse, the authority of the text collapses with them. Even the concept of faith in the Bible reveals its human origin. Faith is often defined as belief without evidence, or trust in unseen things. But when belief requires shutting your eyes to what is plain, it loses credibility. If truth exists, it should stand up to scrutiny. By elevating faith above evidence, the Bible undermines its own claim to be true. The Bible's handling of morality across different cultures also raises problems. For example, slavery is accepted and regulated, not condemned. Today, nearly everyone recognizes slavery as immoral, yet the Bible never clearly rejects it. This silence speaks volumes. It shows that the text reflects the values of its time rather than the eternal truth. And if it cannot speak clearly against something as obviously harmful as slavery, how can it be trusted as a moral guide? Another revealing example is how the Bible treats outsiders who follow different traditions. Often they are condemned not for their actions, but simply for their identity. Whole nations are labeled wicked and targeted for destruction, and this is not morality, it is tribalism. It reflects the concerns of a people struggling to survive and maintain identity, but it cannot serve as a model for universal ethics. All of these points converge on one conclusion. The Bible is full of promises that fail, contradictions that confuse, and morals that reflect ancient limitations. For those willing to read carefully, it does not point to divine truth. It points away from it. And in that sense, the Bible itself becomes one of the most compelling arguments against belief. The Bible also reveals its human roots through the way it treats history. In some cases, it exaggerates victories to show divine favor. In others, it rewrites defeats to place blame on disobedience, and the narratives of kings are shaped less by accuracy and more by theology. A ruler who supports the favored priestly order is praised, while one who resists is condemned. This isn't divine truth, it's politics written as sacred history. And when you recognize that, it becomes clear that the Bible reflects the power struggles of its time rather than eternal reality. Another striking point is the Bible's reliance on authority rather than demonstration. Again and again, it demands belief simply because it says so. Commands are given with threats of punishment for disobedience, not with rational explanation. When Moses brings laws, the justification is not their fairness or logic, but that they come from God. The demand for submission is powerful for controlling a community, but it does not resemble truth that can stand on its own. The Bible also struggles with the idea of fairness. In some stories, the righteous are rewarded and the wicked punished, but in others, the opposite happens. Good people suffer while the cruel prosper. To resolve this tension, later texts introduce the idea of rewards and punishments after death. But this solution raises new problems. Why should an infinite punishment or reward be tied to the brief actions of a single lifetime? The imbalance reveals human attempts to patch over contradictions rather than a consistent moral system. Even the miracles of Jesus, which are supposed to be the strongest evidence for divine power, raise questions. The healings often resemble the practices of wandering healers and miracle workers common in the ancient world. The feeding of multitudes mirrors stories from other cultures. Walking on water, calming storms, raising the dead. All of these fit the pattern of mythic storytelling meant to inspire, not to record history, and the fact that the accounts disagree on details only strengthens the sense that these are stories shaped by communities, not eyewitness reports. Another revealing detail is how the Bible often reflects the values of survival rather than universal morality. Many laws are designed to preserve tribal identity, protect property, or maintain purity. These rules made sense in small, vulnerable societies, but they do not carry lasting moral weight. For example, forbidding certain foods or fabrics was a way of marking identity. It was not about eternal principles of right and wrong. The fact that such rules are presented as divine shows just how deeply human needs shape the text. The Bible also exposes its human nature in the way it handles prophecy. When events did not unfold as expected, explanations were added. When Jerusalem was destroyed, it was blamed on sin. When the return of Christ did not happen quickly, believers were told to wait longer. This shifting of expectations shows that the writers were not receiving clear visions of the future. They were interpreting events after the fact and adjusting their stories to preserve belief. The Bible's approach to knowledge of the natural world is equally revealing. It describes the sun standing still, the earth as immovable, and stars as small lights in the sky. These descriptions fit the worldview of ancient people, but clash with what we know today. If the Bible were truly timeless truth, why would it reflect the errors of its culture rather than knowledge that could withstand centuries of discovery? Even the portrayal of God's character changes in ways that reveal human influence. At times, he is portrayed as deeply involved in human affairs, walking in gardens, appearing in fire or cloud. At other times, he is distant and unreachable. Sometimes he is merciful and forgiving. Other times, he is violent and jealous. These contradictions make sense if different groups had different experiences and projected them onto their idea of God, but they do not make sense if the text is the revelation of a single, unchanging being. Another striking point is the Bible's silence on issues that define modern moral thought. It says nothing about democracy, equality, or human rights, and it offers no guidance on science, medicine, or technology. Yet these are the areas where humanity has advanced most in building a better world. The absence of insight in these areas shows that the Bible is locked in its own time. It cannot serve as a guide for the future when it remains bound by the past. Perhaps the strongest argument hidden within the Bible is its own fragility under honest reading. The more closely one reads, the more the cracks show, the contradictions, the cultural baggage, the failed promises, the shifting prophecies, all combine to reveal a text that is deeply human. For those who approach with honesty, the Bible itself becomes the most powerful reason to doubt the claims made about it. And once that recognition sets in, the way forward becomes clear. Truth does not need to be defended by threats or upheld by fear. It does not require contradictions to be explained away or failed promises to be reinterpreted. Truth stands on its own, and if the Bible cannot stand without constant defense, then perhaps it was never the ultimate truth to begin with. The Bible also highlights the problem of exclusivity. It often claims that truth and salvation can only be found within its own framework, that one group is chosen and others are rejected. This exclusivity may have helped strengthen group identity in ancient times, but it clashes with the reality of a diverse world. Billions of people live meaningful lives outside the biblical framework, yet the text would dismiss them as lost or condemned. If divine truth existed, it would not be limited to one culture, one nation, or one text. The Bible's treatment of children is another revealing issue. In some passages, children are blessed and valued, yet in others, they are killed in plagues, sacrificed in wars, or threatened with punishment for the sins of their parents. These portrayals raise serious moral questions. If children are innocent, why should they suffer? If God is just, why should the guilt of one generation fall on another? These contradictions reflect human struggles with justice, not the wisdom of an eternal being. Another problem lies in the Bible's repeated failures to provide consistent answers about human destiny. Some passages describe resurrection of the body, others speak of immortality of the soul, while others suggest all people go to the same shadowy place. These conflicting views show a development of thought over time, but they do not show a clear, timeless revelation. The uncertainty itself becomes evidence that these were human attempts to grapple with the unknown. Even the Bible's style reflects its human origin. Some parts are poetry, filled with metaphor and imagery. Others are law codes, precise and rigid. Some are historical narratives, others apocalyptic visions. This diversity is fascinating as literature, but it undercuts the idea that the Bible is a single unified message. It shows instead that the text is a library of human writings, each shaped by its own context and concerns. The Bible also contains a deep tension between love and fear. In some places, God is described as loving and merciful. In others, he is described as a consuming fire who demands fear and obedience. The coexistence of these extremes reflects human attempts to balance hope and terror, not a consistent revelation of divine character. And when people are told to love and fear at the same time, the result is confusion, not clarity. One of the clearest signs of human authorship is the way the Bible reflects the political needs of its communities. As when the Israelites were in exile, the text emphasized hope and restoration, and when they were powerful, the text emphasized conquest and dominance. When early Christians were persecuted, the text emphasized endurance and future reward. When they gained influence, the text emphasized order and obedience. These shifts show how the Bible adapted to circumstances. They do not show timeless truth that the Bible's promises of divine justice also fail under scrutiny. Many texts claim that the wicked will be punished and the righteous rewarded in this life. But history shows the opposite again and again. The cruel often prosper, while the kind often suffer. Later writers tried to resolve this by pushing justice into the afterlife, but this solution reveals the weakness of the original claim. If justice cannot be found in reality, then it is promised in another world where it cannot be tested. Another striking problem is how often the Bible's moral vision lags behind human progress. Slavery, patriarchy, violence, and tribalism are accepted in the text. Humanity has moved beyond many of these values, not because of the Bible, but in spite of it. This shows that moral growth comes from human reflection, empathy, and reason, not from the static commands of an ancient text. The Bible also demonstrates how myths evolve into doctrines. A story about a serpent in a garden becomes the basis for the doctrine of original sin. A vision in Daniel becomes the foundation for apocalyptic expectations. A few letters about church order become rules for centuries of hierarchy. This process shows how human imagination and power structures can transform stories into systems of belief. It does not show divine design. What emerges from all of this is a clear picture. The Bible is not a flawless revelation. It is a mirror of human thought, sometimes inspiring, sometimes troubling, often contradictory, and when held up as divine truth, it collapses under its own weight. For those who read carefully, the strongest arguments against belief are not external criticisms. They are the words of the Bible itself. Its contradictions, moral failures, broken promises, and human fingerprints speak louder than any outside critique. And once you see that, the authority of the text falls away. What remains is not despair, but freedom. Freedom to seek truth without fear. Freedom to build morality on compassion and reason rather than obedience and fear. Freedom to see the Bible not as a cage for thought, but as a window into the human past. And in that freedom, people often find a clarity that no ancient text could provide. The Bible also highlights the problem of false certainty. Again and again, it presents claims with absolute authority, yet those claims are often undermined by later discoveries, by contradictions within the text, or by the realities of life. When people are told that the Bible is the final word on truth, but then discover its many flaws, they often feel betrayed. The very insistence on perfection becomes the reason for disbelief. Take the example of creation. The Bible describes a universe formed in 6 days, with the earth created before the stars. Yet science reveals a very different story, one that stretches across billions of years, with stars forming long before the earth. The biblical account matches the imagination of an ancient culture, not the reality revealed by observation. If the Bible were divine, wouldn't it provide knowledge beyond what was available to ancient people? The same is true for medicine, and the Bible treats disease as the result of sin, impurity, or spirits. It prescribes rituals, sacrifices, and isolation, but it offers no knowledge of germs, hygiene, or treatment. Humanity only discovered those truths through science, not Scripture. This absence is telling. If the Bible were a guide for life, why would it offer no insight that could have saved countless lives? The Bible's portrayal of morality also fails when tested against universal principle. Commands to love one's neighbor are paired with commands to kill outsiders. Compassion is praised in some places, but cruelty is demanded in others. This inconsistency reveals the text as a human product of its time, struggling to balance tribal survival with broader visions of morality. It does not reveal a clear or eternal moral law. Another revealing issue is the way the Bible portrays God's emotions. At times, God is wrathful, jealous, regretful, even deceiving. These are deeply human emotions projected onto a divine figure. They make sense as literary devices, but they do not fit the idea of a perfect, unchanging being. The Bible's God often looks less like a divine creator and more like a reflection of the people who wrote about him. Even the concept of covenant exposes the human origin of the text. God is said to make agreements with people, offering blessings in exchange for loyalty. This mirrors the treaties and contracts common in the ancient Near East, where kings would demand allegiance from their subjects. The language of divine covenant is simply the political language of its time applied to religion. It is not a timeless truth, but a cultural adaptation. The Bible also struggles with justice in its treatment of women. They are often silenced, excluded from leadership, and treated as property. Defenders of the text argue that women are still valued, but the plain reading shows inequality, and history has shown that progress toward equality has come not from following the Bible, but from questioning and moving beyond its limitations. This fact alone reveals the text as bound by its culture rather than transcending it. Another issue is the Bible's repeated reliance on violence to solve problems. Enemies are defeated through war, sinners are punished with death, and loyalty is proven through sacrifice. Rarely does the text offer nonviolent alternatives. Yet history has shown that cooperation, dialogue, and compassion are more effective in building peace. If divine wisdom were guiding the text, why does it so often resort to bloodshed? Even the New Testament, often praised for its emphasis on love, contains troubling passages. Jesus speaks of eternal fire. Paul orders women to remain silent, and Revelation describes endless violence and destruction. These elements are rarely highlighted, but they reveal that the same problems of fear, exclusion, and cruelty persist throughout the text. What emerges is a pattern. The Bible is not a unified revelation of divine truth. It is a patchwork of human voices, sometimes compassionate, sometimes cruel, often contradictory. And when those voices are held up as perfect, the flaws become impossible to ignore. The irony is that the Bible, which is supposed to be the strongest foundation for belief, often becomes the strongest reason to question it. People who read carefully, who refuse to look away from the contradictions and failures, discover that the text undermines itself, and once that realization takes hold, the authority of the Bible collapses, but what remains is not emptiness. What remains is the recognition that meaning and morality do not depend on an ancient text. They can be built through reason, empathy, and shared human experience, and the Bible becomes not a prison of dogma, but a record of human struggle. And in that record, people can see both the limits of the past and the possibilities of the future. The Bible also reveals its human limits through its obsession with ritual. From sacrifices to purity laws to detailed instructions for temple worship, much of the text is focused on procedures rather than principles. Burnt offerings, dietary restrictions, washing rituals, these were meaningful in their cultural setting, but they have little bearing on universal morality. Today, no one believes that burning animals brings forgiveness, or that mildew in a house has spiritual significance. These rituals are clearly products of their time, not timeless truths. Even when the Bible attempts to present universal principles, they are often undermined by contradictions. For instance, the command to love your neighbor sits alongside instructions to wipe out entire groups of people. Compassion and cruelty are placed side by side, each carrying divine authority. This contradiction leaves readers with the responsibility of choosing which verses to emphasize, and the very need to choose shows that the text itself cannot stand as a consistent guide. The Bible also demonstrates the human tendency to use religion to justify power. Kings claim divine right to rule, wars are fought in God's name, and priests control communities through rituals and laws. These uses of the Bible are not distortions, they are consistent with the text itself. The Bible repeatedly merges divine authority with human authority, making it difficult to separate faith from power. This merging reveals the text's function as a tool of control as much as a guide to belief. Another problem is the Bible's insistence on exclusivity of worship. It repeatedly demands loyalty to one God and condemns all others. In practice, this meant suppressing the beliefs of neighboring cultures and enforcing conformity. This exclusivity may have unified one community, but it came at the cost of diversity and freedom. If divine truth were universal, it would not need to crush other perspectives to survive. The Bible's portrayal of suffering also reveals its human origin. Sometimes suffering is punishment, sometimes it is a test, sometimes it is beyond explanation. The shifting answers reflect human attempts to make sense of pain, not a clear or consistent revelation, and when innocent people suffer without cause, The Bible's explanations often ring hollow. Telling someone that their suffering is a lesson or a test does not provide comfort or justice. It only highlights the inability of the text to resolve the problem. Even the structure of the Bible points to its human construction. It is not a single unified book, but a collection of writings assembled over centuries. Decisions about what to include and what to exclude were made by councils of men, influenced by politics and power. Entire books, like those later called Apocrypha, were left out. Others were edited or translated in ways that changed their meaning. The final product is not a perfect message from beyond, but the outcome of human choices. The Bible also reveals its human roots in its reliance on fear of punishment and hope of reward. Eternal life is promised to the faithful, eternal torment to the unfaithful. These promises and threats are powerful motivators, but they are also deeply human. They reflect the same techniques used by rulers and leaders throughout history to control people. By tying morality to reward and punishment, the Bible reduces goodness to self-interest rather than compassion. Another revealing aspect is the way the Bible handles doubt. Questioning is often portrayed as dangerous or sinful. People who ask for signs are rebuked. Those who waver are condemned. Yet doubt is a natural part of seeking truth. A system that discourages doubt is not one that seeks truth, but one that seeks obedience. And when the Bible insists on unquestioning faith, it exposes its fragility. The Bible's portrayal of the afterlife is also inconsistent and confused. Some texts describe a shadowy underworld where all the dead go. Others describe resurrection, judgment, heaven, or hell. Even within the New Testament, the details are vague and contradictory. This lack of clarity shows that the afterlife was not revealed truth, but an evolving human idea, shaped by cultural influences from surrounding societies. Perhaps most importantly, the Bible fails when tested against its own claims. It promises fulfilled prophecies, answered prayers, protection for the faithful, and moral clarity. Yet it delivers contradictions, failed promises, unanswered prayers, and moral confusion. By its own standard, it falls short. And that failure makes the Bible one of the strongest arguments against the very faith it seeks to uphold. For many people, this realization is the turning point. Once they see that the Bible undermines itself, the authority they once gave it disappears. What remains is the freedom to seek truth in other ways. Through evidence, through compassion, through shared human experience, the Bible becomes a historical artifact, valuable for understanding the past, but not for dictating the future. Thanks for watching.